Hello everyone, and I hope you are well today. Today I wanted to talk about masks, masculinity, and whiteness, and the whole video has a punny title, which is Masculinity with a K, because really what I want to get into is how responses to mask wearing are informed by whiteness and masculinity. More so than being a conservative versus liberal thing, though it has been politicized as that too, and I'll touch on that later in the video. I want to suggest that responses to the precautions we're being asked to take are deeply informed by psychological and identity structures that we've learned throughout our lives, and I want to reflect upon this in the context of my own experience, because I too have had resistance to mask wearing and other guidelines, and I feel that sharing my experience and learning around this could be deeply useful for other people, whether for them personally or because they want to share with a friend who may bristle at these things when they don't, and perhaps there's a misunderstanding between the two and some education can take place. Not only with this issue, but with all issues, I feel it is very important to lead with vulnerability and stories so that we invite others to join in movements that we see as progressive, rather than castigate them or shame them for not having taken part already. So I hope that my story can serve that purpose. So this takes place obviously during coronavirus and the lockdown. When this first began several months ago, like many people, for the first, I would say, month of the pandemic, I was in this sort of dreamy, open, optimistic interior landscape where I was noticing that suddenly the economy had stopped on a dime, and I was intrigued by the possibilities for creating more healthful structures that suddenly we had. You know, it had seemed until that very moment that we could never do something like shut down the entire economy, something that, say, environmental activists had really longed for, and all of a sudden here it was. So I was caught and transfixed by that, and similarly by the lack of pollution that I suddenly saw around me. I thought, wow, I haven't seen the sky like this, I haven't heard the birds like this, I haven't seen the roads so empty in so long. And so I think many people will remember that first month or so of the pandemic as feeling very dreamy and rife with possibility. After that, things began to change and my mood began to sour, and I started to feel a lot of grief and anger, I would say, as a defense against that grief. In my personal life, there were many palpable sources for these emotions. For instance, I had a wedding planned for this September, and ultimately my fiance and I chose to postpone our wedding a year. So there were a lot of conflicting emotions about that, and I really had to go through cycles of grief around that. Along the same lines, but to a lesser degree, I also graduated from a master's program, and I had a birthday, I had a retreat scheduled that was canceled. There were these many minor losses in my life that aggregated to this sense of grief, longing, loss of control. And I think anger can kind of rest atop those other emotions as the search for a cause, search for someone to blame, search for someone to take this injustice out upon. So all of that was happening in my personal life. Sort of on the surface level, or I could say as an extension or as a part of my political identity, I started to look into conspiracy theory type stuff, which, runs the gamut from suggesting that COVID and lockdown could be exploited in deleterious ways by world governments, to suggesting that the entire pandemic is a fiction and the only purpose is to control the population. So I was really reading this stuff and feeling a lot of agitation in my core. It was an expression, a vehicle for my anger, an outlet, right? Before going on here, I do want to say that the point of this video, and I think it should be clear just from my general style, is not to blame or dismiss anyone who is engaged in researching such material, anyone who finds themselves drawn to conspiracy theories. First of all, I think there are many times in recent and lengthier past when governments and corporations have lied to their constituents. That's something we're fairly habituated to. And I think we're simply less prone to accept it when someone suggests that it's happening in the present than we are when someone establishes that it occurred in the past. It's a simple defensive structure. It's easy for me to say that someone other than myself was fooled in the past, or to say that I myself was fooled when I was younger and more naive, when I knew less. It's easier to say those things than it is to suggest or to posit that I might be getting fooled in the present. That kind of threatens my ego. And so I think a lot of the labeling of all of these theories, the categorization of them writ large as conspiracy theories, has to do with that defensiveness, not wanting to feel stupid, not wanting to feel like I was duped or missed something. So I'm not inherently skeptical of conspiracy theories by any means. The other thing I would say about them is they bear a strange connection with spirituality. As followers of my YouTube channel and readers of my blog will know, I practice meditation and yoga as my main inlets to spirituality. And as a consequence of these, I develop a greater and greater ability to watch my life play itself out from a remove, from a more distant and dispassionate perspective. Something this begins to feel like is a simulation. It feels like my life is a set of bodily processes and energies just kind of running themselves out like a hamster wheel or like a system. And from that understanding, the suggestion that there is some ulterior design at play, that someone is setting off dominoes that are resulting in the seemingly disconnected events we see before us, which is really the essence of conspiracy theories, right? Someone is controlling, designing the simulation. This doesn't seem so far-fetched to us as we start to become acquainted with the inherently strange nature of reality. So I actually think that a part of spiritual evolution can be traipsing into these conspiracy theories. So I just wanted to add that as well. Nevertheless, in my story, I was looking into these theories and I was becoming resistant to things like mask wearing, like the 6-foot distancing, canceling large events, not having friends over for dinner, all the losses that come along with it. And I also was reminded of and kind of became more forcefully committed to alternative healing modalities that might say, for example, lockdown is intrinsically detrimental to the nervous system because we're no longer having contact with, dirt and other beings and bacteria that would kind of enrich our natural capacities for defense. Or I found myself more drawn than I had been recently to the idea of manifestation, the idea that, if we believe we'll get the virus, then we will get the virus, that we can attract it in some way. A parallel would be the idea that fear is negative for our immune system, and that we must purge fear and live optimistically, and then we will cultivate this kind of spiritual immunity. So all of these ideas were rising for me. More recently, I've had a shift, and I now wear masks or wear a mask when I'm, grocery shopping. We have started to have people over to our apartment, and I'll wear a mask then, especially if they request it. And the resistance that I was experiencing has dropped, and I want to talk about the source of that shift, because again, I feel there may be many people for whom this is important to hear. I won't say that I myself am suddenly more afraid of the virus than I was before, but instead there is understanding of my emotional ecology, understanding of masculinity, whiteness, and compassion for others, and a base sense of politeness that is driving my choices. And so the essence of this video is talking about how all of that comes about. To begin to get into it, as a backdrop for everything else that was happening over the past few months, and it's continuing today, I have also observed myself drawn to and moved through what I think of as a curriculum around masculinity and whiteness. For instance, the retreat I was going to attend in the spring that was canceled was the Mankind Project, which is about cultivating healthy masculinity and a sense of mission or purpose as a way of healing the world. Because the physical retreat was canceled due to COVID, I was given a virtual supplement, an online version of this course that I just completed with other men. I was also invited to a friend's coaching workshop and attended that, and that is a men's group as well. I'm trying to think, there was one other thing I wanted to mention that had to do with masculinity. But that's okay. On the whiteness topic, since George Floyd's death, I've also been reflecting more greatly on my whiteness, and I'm currently in a reading group with other white people around the book White Fragility. So I've been navigating and processing these topics while having all these other emotional responses, and really in the past few days, something has crystallized for me about how they all interact, how they all converge, and how whiteness and masculinity are responsible for the earlier resistance I had to mask wearing and to maintaining 6-foot distance. By the way, I feel this is mostly just for personal saving face. I want you to know that it's not as though I ever hugged someone when they asked me not to, or brazenly refused to wear a mask when I was asked to. It is rather that in those early months, I would never wear one at the grocery store. I would express kind of resentment about having to maintain these rules privately before I was in a circumstance to actually do so. And I just want to talk about the subconscious, the subterranean level and what was going on there. Because again, I feel that vulnerably sharing about this might help others come to parallel realizations. So the first thing that these examinations of whiteness and masculinity have helped me realize about mask wearing and 6-foot distancing in particular is that being schooled as a white man in the United States of America for my entire life, I have never before truly had my bodily freedom infringed upon. If you think about not only the messages that a white man receives from, say, reading a Eurocentric version of American history, which emphasizes something like the Declaration of Independence, right? The Declaration is very individualistic. It's about my ability to pursue prosperity and liberty. And for the white man, that reading of history doesn't contain the contradictions that it does for other people who knew that who know that at that time in history they did not have the right to vote, they were enslaved, they had been dispossessed of their land. The ironies of this history do not exist for the white man. And so as I learn my country's history, I learn this is a place for me to freely express myself using my body in all the ways I am drawn to. I learned that growing up. But in addition to that, as I was saying, there's also the hidden curriculum of media messaging. And if you think about the dominant script that we received from films growing up, particularly in a romantic comedy, the base plot of the film entails the white man seizing the woman as his property. And often the second and third act of the film are composed of her denying his efforts. So a no is not received as the end of the game, but rather as an obstacle in continued conquest. And so I received all of these messages subtly growing up, even though I had, a feminist mother and father who told me the importance of respecting other people's bodily autonomy. The cultural influences, I think, are more powerful, the cultural stew in which we swim, than any singular household, any controlled influence like that. And so growing up, I learned my body is my tool to express myself in the world, and there is kind of this absolute freedom that it has and should have. And I didn't see the contradictions that other people may see when reading American history because they did not exist for my identity type. And so inherently, when I'm told to wear a mask and maintain 6-foot distance, there's a level of resistance for me that might not exist for someone whose bodily freedom was never so absolute. That's my first point. The second point has to do with the way in which this all dovetails with consent. And I think this is very important for white men in particular to hear. So when I am being asked to wear a mask and I'm around someone else who's wearing a mask, I now have to ask, can I remove my mask right now? Is it okay if we talk with our masks off, for instance? Or I have to ask at a restaurant, what are the rules about wearing a mask when I'm sitting at the table? Is it allowable to take off my mask at the table, or do I have to wear it there too? Similarly with the 6-foot distance, right? This does remain a suggestion. And I've had instances throughout this period where I've been with someone for whom I know the social distancing guidelines are very important. Say they have a compromised immune system, they're at greater risk. And I'll say, are you okay with a hug? And they'll say yes or no. And I respect that answer. Previously, I might have just opened my arms and kind of expected the hug from the other person, and they would, fall into it, and we would have what seemed to be an agreement, what seemed to be consent, but it would be tacit. It would be unspoken. And now I have to verbally ask, or else it's very rude. As a kind of case study that brings this home, I was talking with a friend the other day, a fellow white man, and he was with his father recently. His father's also a white man, and his father asked to hug him at a point in the interaction, and he said, "No, I don't think I'm comfortable with a hug right now." And as they were parting ways, his father said, "Come here," and hugged him anyway. And my friend is still experiencing, pretty heightened anger about this, and doesn't know how to bring it up to his father or whether. This kind of event epitomizes the violation of consent that so many people, generally speaking, not white men, although, as we know, white men can experience this as well, have experienced throughout their lifetimes, experienced this violation of consent. And it generally happens at the hands of those for whom this concept of bodily freedom has been absolute, like myself. Having internalized this curriculum that the world is my playground, that in some sense the world is my property to do with what I wish, I am much more likely to violate people's understanding, other people's understanding of their own autonomy. And the consent that we are being asked to practice in the age of social distancing guidelines is somewhat new for some white men. We are learning the verbal and social techniques that perhaps we should have known all along, but because of our privileged status in this society, we never had to learn them. And that was to other people's detriment. So I want to suggest that that too is part of what's going on. I'm going to have a third point, but I'm going to take a drink of water first. I reserve the right for that. I like to drink water in my videos, and I don't like to edit them, so I guess it'll just be a hallmark. So the third thing about mask wearing in particular that I think is significant from this vantage is that it's become a political identity. And I think everyone, whether liberal or conservative, has noticed this happening. Probably it happened more concretely after George Floyd's death, because suddenly you had millions of people in the streets protesting while wearing masks, and there were polarized views about the meaning of that. But I think the roots of it are deeper, and I can see them tracing all the way back to the start of the pandemic in myself. So, on the surface level, wearing a mask means I believe in science, I trust doctors, and I have compassion for my fellow beings. I understand that wearing a mask is about protecting them and not about myself, right? More subtly, it might also mean I stand against Donald Trump because the mask wearing proviso is associated with Anthony Fauci, who often deviates from Trump and experiences conflict with Trump. And also Trump in general appears to be against social distancing and mask wearing, and appears to prioritize the economy above all else. And so then the converse would be true, right? Not wearing a mask has come to symbolize I am for economic freedom, I am against control, And perhaps I have distrust of the media. I have distrust of the ways in which this information is being presented to me, and perhaps there's an agenda behind it. And perhaps it's made to, or it's meant to make Donald Trump look bad, right? This is another supposition. We might be drawn in this identity of not wearing the mask to look at statistics that show that the COVID death count has been inflated, and it's not as damaging even as a bad flu year, and so on and so forth. So there are all of those associations with this very with what could be the neutral symbol of wearing a mask. So I wanted to touch on all of that, but it's actually not my focus. My focus is on what, through reading, studying, reflecting upon whiteness and masculinity, I have realized the mask initially symbolized for me through that entire period that I experienced resistance toward wearing it. And that is fear. To me, the mask symbolized, I am afraid of getting the virus. And alongside and in tandem with my attraction to all sorts of alternative healing modalities and spiritual frameworks that position fear as negative and as something that would predispose us to getting the virus, I had a resistance to publicly displaying that I could be afraid of something like this. So I wanted not to wear the mask to show I am not afraid. It was admittedly purely an ego thing, purely about me. Look at me. I am continuing robustly marching through this world in the same way I always have been, and nothing is going to take me down. And I've realized how central this is to masculinity. So even if we look at a quote-unquote positive form of masculinity, so something central to the Mankind Project and to the curriculum they use is Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. And the idea of the hero's journey is that an individual undertakes this descent into their own psychic depths to discover and transfigure the darkness there, and then reemerges into the world with wisdom to share, with some form of knowledge or gift that they can then use to transform the world. So it's very individualistic notion, but it's also fundamentally about conquering fear. It positions me as someone above and a master of my fear who must overcome that fear to gain riches. So fear is construed as the enemy, even in a positive form of masculinity. We also see this pretty unilaterally in spiritual communities and in prominent spiritual discourses. So the phrase comes to mind, this is from Dune, I think, fear is the mind killer, right? Fear is something that I must rid my mind of in order to pursue enlightenment. Or we have the adage, love is greater than fear. This idea that they represent opposite poles and that I can live at either one or the other, and it's a choice. Just because of the time in which I am making this video log, I also think it's relevant to point to a popular and contemporary piece of writing that contains this same dynamic, and that is the Coronation essay, which you may have read, by Charles Eisenstein. It was kind of viral when it first came out, which was a week or two after the pandemic began. And if I could summarize it, the Coronation says, we don't know much about the coronavirus, but we do know that we are being asked to live in fear. We are being asked to live in a tyranny of fear. And we might want to question how many of our freedoms, how much of our lives are we willing to give over or lay to rest at the altar of fear, right? Are we willing to live in fear, live a reduced existence forever, just because we are told so, just because we are told that it's safe? And in this essay too, and Charles Eisenstein does have a very spiritual leaning, he is certainly part of that world, that community. The hidden enemy, the coded enemy in the essay is fear. The idea is that love and fear are these two opposite poles, and we can conquer fear and choose love, but it is a definitive and finalistic act, and we cannot have the two together. So all of that is very core to masculinity. One of my earliest memories is being on a playground, and there was one of those two-tiered play structures where, you know, say there was a slide off the bottommost tier, and then as you got up higher, there was a pole that you could jump off of and slide down. And I remember there was this older child who had the guts to jump all the way off of the top play structure without holding on to the pole. He was also taller than I was because he was older than I was, but still I wanted to be able to jump off like he could without holding on to the pole. And it was my mother who suggested, you know, maybe you can jump off just holding onto the pole as an intermediary, and maybe you'll eventually gain enough courage that you can jump off without holding on to it. And eventually I did. But even at that young age, even at 3, 4, I had this sense that to be afraid of jumping off was not okay. So I think all of this is really important to examine, because once I realized that the resistance to wearing the mask was really coming from this implicit understanding, and no one had ever told me this, it was in my mind, in my psychic structure, in my sort of internal symbology, I had this understanding that wearing the mask signifies that I am afraid, and it's not okay to be afraid. And I think that is so core to masculinity and whiteness. And again, even this positive notion of masculinity, quote unquote positive, that we might see through something like the Mankind Project or Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, positions fear as something we must conquer. So I read a critique last week of Charles Eisenstein's The Coronation, and I thought it was really brilliant. Maybe I'll link to it in the description of this video if I can find it again. But I thought it was really brilliant, and I want to bring it up because it suggests an alternative to this ecology, this way of being that says we must conquer fear. This essay identified the supposition of fear as the enemy in Charles Eisenstein's essay. And as I have shared, it also noted that this is a common sort of duality in spiritual circles, and that fear is often subjugated to love, and the two are seen as separate and mutually exclusive. And this essay also said, you know, what spiritual people, and men in particular, need to recognize is that fear and love are actually connected, and you cannot truly experience one without the other. And upon reading this, it dawned on me that this is really what we see when we see a mother of any species taking care of her young. It can be a human mother, or it can be any animal. She can get very agitated and aggressive when there's a predator, when there's a threat. and, you know, can really like hold her young close and snarl. And what we're seeing there are two things at once: the love for the young and the fear that something is going to happen to them. And the two are inextricably interconnected. And I feel this is important for men, and perhaps white men in particular, to hear, because if I can have that understanding that fear is okay and that love and fear actually mutually strengthen each other, then I have an entirely different reaction to the mask. Let's say I'm still not afraid for myself that I am going to get coronavirus, or even further, let's say I know that if I did get the virus, I would be okay, which is how I feel about myself. And there's a much larger conversation we could have there about privilege, diet, exercise, all the factors that all the factors that have led to my feeling that I am not personally at risk from this disease. Even acknowledging that, I can still recognize others' fear no longer as some kind of threat to me. They're afraid, but I can't be afraid, and I have to prove that I'm not afraid, and I'm going to do it by pursuing these conspiracy theories and showing them that they're dumb, right? There's that reaction. But there can be this other reaction of pure and uninhibited compassion and generosity that says, even if I am not afraid personally, I am going to respect your rule, and I'm going to see what I can do for you that can help you to feel less afraid, or that can help you to feel more safe. And this compassionate and open-hearted gesture comes from no longer demonizing fear. To the degree that I demonize fear, I will reject it not only in myself, but in the other as well. And I am suggesting that the politicization of the mask and the need to prove wrong or prove stupid those who wear it comes from, in my internal landscape, not accepting my own fear. So again, to the degree that I can do that, I am going to show up compassionately and helpfully, which as a byproduct is something we could say not only men, but all people, all adults, all children should strive for. We want to be helpful, we want to be generous, we want to be kind. I can do that through accepting my own fear and acknowledging its connection to love. So that was the most important and I think practical and immediate point I wanted to make in this video. I just want to leave you with a larger and I think more amorphous takeaway about what is happening in this time. So I've spoken in this video about my own curriculum growing up, the hidden curriculum of whiteness and masculinity that told me the world was mine to do with what I wanted, which certainly led to my trampling upon others' freedoms without even realizing it. And that is part of the reckoning of this moment for people like me. I also think in this time, part of what's happening with impositions like the mask or disruptions to life that we see through things like climate change or instability in democracy or institutions that we had traditionally valued or trusted, a lot of what's happening is that there is a grand leveling of types of people and ways of being. So people like myself who have traditionally been privileged and in that way blind to many realities, we are being saddled with new burdens for us, and we are being brought down. And people who have traditionally been oppressed or also ways of being that have traditionally been oppressed or undervalued, they are being brought up. There is a leveling of hierarchies, a dismantling of hierarchies occurring. And this is not only our contemporary moment or even my lifetime. This is part of a larger process. You can see some of the roots of this in the US in the 1960s. And if you follow astrology at all, this is what has been prophesied as the age of Aquarius. Aquarius is all about equality among types, non-hierarchy. It's about knowing that from a spiritual perspective, we are all the same, we are all one. So this is a process that is meeting itself out slowly but surely, generation by generation. And I do not believe it will be finished in my lifetime, but I do believe we are making and will make significant headway in that time. And I simply want to suggest that this kind of leveling is beneficial for all people. To the degree that my personhood is something narrow and myopic or abstract, right? For example, based on this idea of absolute freedom and play that, even though I don't know it, actually negates the freedom of others and relies on the oppression of others. If my identity is founded on something like that, then there's so much about myself that I don't and cannot know. I don't know what it's like to be oppressed. I don't know what it's like to be aware or afraid of my body, because that's not something I was taught or learned. I don't know what it's like to practice the consent and clear communication among people that breeds true intimacy. All of these things are barred from my awareness and thus from my humanity by virtue of the narrowness of my identity. And so as this leveling occurs, something that happens for all people is that we learn more about ourselves through having a greater richness of experience, a greater diversity of experience. We learn that what it is to be a human is not to have power over others or to have a singular or individualistic brand of achievement, but rather to know ourselves in myriad situations through encountering the other as oneself. And that happens through this kind of leveling, which is a form of discourse or conversation among souls. On the soul level, the oppressed person is saying to the privileged person, this is how it feels to be me, and vice versa. And both beings, through that shared understanding, are growing into a greater fullness of identity, which is simultaneously more complex. An identity that embraces diversity and that recognizes the other as oneself. So I just want to submit that what is happening now, whether or not you are experiencing any resistance toward it, is part of a much greater and extremely important process, because it is one that will spiritually liberate all people. So thank you for listening, and thank you for taking part in this journey with me, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.